Welcome to our CV parents and seniors. Nice. Look at that jumping up. Yay! We've got a fun, fast, informative hour for you here tonight. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our presenter tonight. This is going to be a great hour presentation for you and have some Q&A time. You're welcome to use the Q&A box for any questions you have, not the chat box, and we will respond to those questions during the session if we can, or Mr. Schrader will respond to you at the close of the session. So Mr. Schrader is the Financial Aid Director at Los Angeles Mission College in Sylmar, California. And he is the former Assistant Director of Financial Aid at our own Glendale College. He has over 25 years of financial aid experience and is the past president of the California Community College Financial Aid Administrators Association. So Mr. Schrader, Dennis, take it away.
All right, thank you all. It's good to have you out tonight. So we're going to get right into the presentation. And keep in mind what I talked about tonight about financial aid is applicable to any type of college or university or trade school that your students might be considering attending, because the concepts are the same regardless of the type of school that you're looking at. So first, some basic premises. First and foremost, students and parents are considered to be the primary sources for funding a college education and are expected to contribute to the extent they are able to. And so that's really what financial aid is about, trying to measure the family's ability, not the willingness, to pay for a college education. Along with that, of course, financial aid really is supplemental to family resources, student earnings if they're working, or other resources that the family might be receiving. Along with that, financial aid is intended to pay for education-related expenses, but it goes beyond just tuition and fees, and we'll talk about that in the next few slides. Just so you know, this presentation is probably going to be made available to you from the counselors, but also at the last two slides are links to an English and Spanish version PDF of this. So again, broad concepts that apply to any type of school. We want to look at and break down cost of attendance, expected family contribution, and financial need, because you're going to hear these terms as you apply for financial aid. So first and foremost, cost of attendance. Before a school can award financial aid, we really have to have an idea of what does it cost to go to school for the coming year. So of course, tuition and fees, the cost of the classes, books and supplies, and these can be getting better. Luckily, a lot of schools are using freer resources, but this can be a major expense. Room and board, easy to understand for the student who lives on campus, but also, excuse me here. It's been a long, dry day. Room and board, even for students who live off campus or even with their parents, we can figure a certain amount of cost for living. Personal expenses, medical insurance, car insurance, things like that. And lastly, transportation, especially like a school like mine or even Glendale Community College, your closest counterpart there. Students commute most of the time. When we're back on campus, I should say, students are commuting most of the time. So a school can look at all these categories and figure out for every student who applies for aid, what's their estimated cost for the school year. So that's our starting point. The next item, the expected family contribution. This is the amount a family is expected they can contribute based on income and assets as reported on the FAFSA towards the cost of a school year. This number is calculated for you. You don't get to make it up on your own, but it's why we do the FAFSA, the free application for federal student aid. It gives us an idea, high or low, of the financial need for the student. So lastly, what's financial need? It's really taking that cost of attendance for the school year, subtracting that expected family contribution, and coming up with need. Easier to explain by showing you some example numbers and how the formula works. So if we had a California Community College, a Cal State, a UC, and a private school, and these are relatively realistic numbers, Now, of course, it doesn't cost $15,500 to go to Glendale College, but remember, it's beyond tuition and fees. It's books and supplies, living costs, things you have a lot of control over. At a Cal State or UC, tuition's higher, and certainly at a private school, it could be even higher. Now, when you do the FAFSA, it will calculate an expected family contribution. And so if you did the FAFSA tonight and it comes back to result and says your EFC is $4,000, it's the same at any type of school you might apply to, because it's about the family's ability to contribute towards the cost. So what's the difference? It's that bottom line number there, the need. And in a sense, that's the number we start with at a financial aid office to try to meet as much of that need as possible through all the different financial aid programs out there and available. So what kind of money is out there? The free money, the grants and scholarships, things like the federal Pell Grant, the state's Cal Grant program. Going to USC, maybe there's a USC scholarship or grant based on need or other criteria, but money that doesn't have to get repaid. There's work. Federal Work Study is the main program. In a sense, students earn some of their financial aid as they go to school. And lastly, loans. You know, loans that a student may take out and repay when they're out of school, or loans that a parent may be able to take out, even through the federal government, and make repayment shortly after the loan's been taken out. A school tries to maximize the free money first, think of work opportunities, and then loans as options. So work and loans, optional. We assume if we offer you free money, you'll take it. And where the money comes from? Well, the two main sources, the federal government and state governments. About 80% of all financial aid comes from the combined efforts across the U.S. in a sense of the federal government, probably 70%, and the state governments add up to another 10%. The good thing is when it comes to applying for aid, it's one form, the free application for federal student aid. For colleges and universities themselves, often the money that they make available is fairly proportional to the cost of a school. So you'll find a school like Caltech or USC, expensive schools, will offer a higher amount of financial aid than a community college. And again, because they want to make sure they get a wide variety of students in the doors. We'll talk a little bit about how some colleges or universities use a standard form for figuring out some of the financial aid they'll offer. We'll talk about that after the FAFSA. Lastly, everything else under the sun. High school clubs and organizations a student might be involved with, local clubs and organizations you as parents may be involved in, scholarship foundations, nationally, like Coca-Cola Scholars, the Gates Millennium Scholarship Program from Bill and Melinda Gates. And then lastly, employers may offer scholarships or tuition reimbursement programs. The idea with financial aid is to make sure to cover all bases, apply where you can, so that you know what kind of options you have available. Now, just so you know, kind of all the different federal aid programs, because these will be the first ones hopefully you tap into by doing the federal aid form. There's at the top, Federal Pell Grant, the main grant program bill available from the federal government. FSCOG for short is a supplemental grant, usually for the students who qualify at the highest level for Pell Grant. In a sense, the students who have a zero family contribution. For those looking at going into teaching, there's a grant called the Teach Grant, an extra $4,000 a year. Federal Work Study, again, working on campus. Student loans from the federal government are known as federal direct student loans. Direct meaning that the government, in a sense, is funding it straight out of the U.S. Treasury. And then parent loans also go by the name PLUS loans. And these are loans that parents and many students can take out on top of other aid. Usually it's the last option to help pay for the students' educational costs for the year. The good thing, again, all these start with that federal aid form, one form. On the state side, for California residents, and I'll explain the asterisk on the next slide, we have Cal Grants A, B, and C, slightly different qualifications on grade point average and some financial need, but different slightly in what they're what you could qualify for. California College Promise Grant, for those who might have gone to a community college and got the BOG, the Board of Governors fee waiver, this is the same thing with a fancy new name. It basically, for about half the students who go to community colleges, waives your enrollment fees, your tuition. So it's a great program to have. It's usually the first thing we look at when we see FAFSA results for students. Now, for those who don't qualify for Cal Grant because the income is just a little too high, there is what's called the Middle Class Scholarship. It's available at the UCs and Cal State universities. It can cover up to about 40% of tuition costs. Lastly, for our current or former foster youth, we have the Chafee Grant. It's up to $5,000 a year, usually on top of other state grants like the Cal Grant, at the Promise Grant is noted here, and possibly Pell Grant for foster youth and former foster youth. The big thing with state aid, it does have a deadline. You have to have applied by the 2nd of March for consideration. The good thing is the FAFSA comes out October 1st. You've got many months to take care of this. In the olden days, when I did aid and got aid, the FAFSA used to come out January 1st. You had 2 months to get done. Now you have plenty of time, but you want to do it sooner than later. So what that asterisk is about is for financial aid for undocumented students. So here in the state of California, a law passed about 20 years or so ago called AB 540 allowed undocumented students who graduated high school in California, met a couple other criteria, to pay the in-state rate at the public schools, the community colleges, the Cal State universities, and the UC system. About 10 years ago, they opened up with a different set of laws, eligibility for the state grant programs. So Cal Grants, Middle Class Scholarship, and the California College Promise Grant are all programs an AB 540 student, as we call them sometimes, or dreamers, you can call them dreamers, could qualify if they go to schools in California. Now, the thing is, you can't do the FAFSA. It is specifically for federal aid eligible students. So California did the next best thing. They created the California Dream Act application, or CADA. Give you an idea what it looks like. This is a relatively new picture I took off the website called caldreamact.org. Easiest way to get to it. The good thing is with the Cal Dream Act, it comes out October 1st, just like the FAFSA. The questions on the FAFSA and the Dream Act are very similar. Because the Cal Dream Act law that California created was meant to model on the FAFSA. So timing, the type of information, all very similar. So I'm not going to cover a lot more on the Dream Act itself, but know when I talk about FAFSA, very similar process. Because the rest of the night, we're going to talk mainly about the FAFSA, the free application for federal student aid. You get to it through studentaid.gov. You can still go to FAFSA.gov, but the federal government really wants us to utilize studentaid.gov. The reason for that is studentaid.gov is not just the FAFSA, but it's all the information about the different federal aid programs and other things related to it. Now, you can also download the My Student Aid mobile app from the federal government, so it's a safe app, and do your FAFSA through your phone or other mobile device. Cal Grant GPA verification, again, like I said slightly earlier, GPA is one criteria for Cal Grant consideration. High schools are sending these all electronically, so there's nothing that you have to do on your part. But just to let you know, that's done on your part and sent to the California Student Aid Commission, the people in Sacramento that handle the Cal Grant program. They receive all the FAFSA results for students who are from California and looking at California schools. Lastly, we'll talk about this form a little bit later, the CSS Profile form. If you're looking at schools like Stanford or Occidental or USC around here or Ivy Leagues, you may have heard of this form. Also comes out October 1st, luckily, but it is a separate form for institutional aid from the schools themselves. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. Lastly, sometimes after you've done the FAFSA, a college may ask for additional information, tax returns, verification of identity documents to make sure we have the right citizenship status or state residency. That's all done through the school. The FAFSA is a federal aid site. Our dreamers use caldreamact.org, which is a state-only site. The profile form is done by the College Board, the people who do the testing. But a college itself may ask for additional information, and you'll work through the financial aid office. Now, the FAFSA itself, this is kind of the color scheme and look to it all, starting at studentaid.gov. And there are a couple different buttons, brand new students or those who might be logging in. And so the reason there's a login there is you'll do the FAFSA every year because every year you have to update the information. And so once you've done one, you become a returning user doing your next year's FAFSA. On the My Student Aid mobile app, same idea. You'll work through the FAFSA piece by piece. It may take a little bit longer on a smaller mobile device like a phone, only because with a web browser, they can put 5 questions on the screen. The mobile will just be one at a time, but it'll be the same sequence of questions asked of you about the student, about the parents, and more. And I'll answer some of this Q&A stuff about assets when we get in a couple more screens, so don't worry, we'll cover it. One of the things we recommend before you even do the FAFSA is that the student should go and create themselves a federal student aid or FSA ID. In a sense, it's a credential. It's your username and password you'll use to log into the FAFSA and electronically sign the FAFSA. The other thing is, one of the parents in the household, as long as they have a social security number and they're a U.S. citizen or an eligible non-citizen, should create an FSA ID of their own. The reason is, for most students coming out of high school, you need parent information on the FAFSA, and thus the parent will need to electronically sign the FAFSA. Now, if a parent is undocumented themselves, for example, but the student is a U.S. citizen, the student will sign electronically with their FSA ID, but the parent will have to print out a signature page and send that off in the mail, get matched up with all the students' electronic FAFSA information. Give you an idea what the FAFSA looks like from the start. They're going to ask right up front, usually, what the role is of the person on the computer. And the reason is, most of the time, it should be the student doing most of the form. Most of the questions are about the student. There will be a part that's about the parents and all, but it really be the student. The part about parents having 2 separate logins, just so you know, both parents can get their own FSA IDs, but at the end of a FAFSA, they only need one of the parents to sign electronically. Now, a parent can log in and start a FAFSA, but they may be limited on how much they can do. They can't sign for their student. Even if they're under 18, the student still has to sign. The last option of being a preparer is if you're actually paying someone to prepare the FAFSA for you. Hopefully you don't need to do that. The FAFSA is not that hard. It's not like tax returns. It's much easier for a student and parent together to get through the form. Beyond that, that little or other screen there is about logging in if you have an FSA ID. So the student would put their username, password, log in, and go from there. On the web browser, at the top of every page, you'll see these steps along the way. So it starts with student demographics on the left, name, address, phone number, things like that. School selection, we'll look at that a little bit tonight. That's where the student can enter the colleges and universities they're considering so that they get the results of the FAFSA. Dependency status, we'll look at that one too, just because I want to make sure for students who think, well, I'm an independent student for whatever reason, well, let's see if the FAFSA really considers you to be one. Most students coming out of high school will be considered dependent students, and we'll need parent information. So we'll look a little bit at parent side too, and we'll answer some of the questions, especially when it comes to parents who might be separated or divorced and how to take care of that. The grade levels, just so you know, for the GPA, sophomore and junior year. I see that question just pop up. So those are the grade levels they use for calculating that grade point average. So college search. So again, a student wants to list all the colleges and universities they're considering attending on the FAFSA. There's some limitation. They'll only let you list 10 at a time. We'll talk about what to do if you got more than 10. But as far as listing them, they don't have to go in any particular order. You don't have to type them in a particular order. But every UC, every Cal State University, and every one of the 116 community colleges in California, at least, are separate schools. So if you're looking at 5 UCs and 5 Cal States, that's 10. Not a problem. You get as many as you can onto the form, continue through the rest of the form, submit it. Once processed, the student will get the email saying it's been processed. The student can then go back into the FAFSA, come right to this section only, take all those schools off and add another 10. Submit. Those schools will get the result also. And even if a school is no longer on the list, but they were on the list and submitted, they can process a student for financial aid. I know there are some students out there that look at a lot of schools in-state, out-of-state, whatever. Doesn't matter how you combine them. You can list 10, 20, 30 or so, but switch them out in large numbers. That's what I always say. Don't do one at a time. But to find a school, you can enter the state that it's in, part of the name. Like if I knew I was looking at UC Irvine, I could just say the state is California, the school's name is Irvine, and it'll give me back the search results on that. There's only 2 schools I know in California, Irvine Valley College and UC Irvine. You selected, you start building your list of up to 10 schools. When you do see that list, it'll be all in some kind of order. For example, here, just to let you know, they will ask you about estimated housing plans, living on campus maybe, living off campus on your own, or living with a parent or relative. It just helps the school kind of figure out the appropriate amount for that cost of attendance, because obviously to live at home costs less than to live on campus. It doesn't generally mean you miss out on free money if you say you are living at home. It usually means less student loans or work study potentially, because you may not always get more money just because it costs more to say live on campus. On to the dependency status questions. So these questions are the ones that the federal government uses to determine if a student's independent. The first one they don't put out there because it's based upon date of birth is in the student demographics section is students have to be 24 or older to be old enough that by age alone, they're an independent student. So I assume there are no 24-year-old high school seniors, I hope. So that question we don't have to worry about. But the first one that pops up is the student, what is your marital status today? So if the student is married, they're independent. So hopefully there's not going to be some surprises when starting your FAFSAs at home, but I assume most high school seniors are single still. The next couple questions coming up are about dependents. So if the student has a dependent child who will receive more than half the support from the student, they're an independent student. Now, we do have to keep in mind then, it's the student who's providing more than half that support, not the parents of the student per se, but the student themselves. The question right below that, is about having other dependents other than a child or spouse. Realistically, most 18-year-olds would not have other dependents. So we'd answer no and no. We get a few more questions. Now, these are put in box form because sometimes students have more than one of these. We'll just run down the boxes real quick. The top one, if you're currently serving on active duty in the military, again, that's not a thing for most high school seniors. Right below that, if you're a veteran of the armed forces, not going to have that either. The middle one there, at any time since turning age 13, were both your parents deceased, so were you an orphan, or were you in foster care? So in other words, someone who is a current or former foster youth, somewhere between the ages of 13 and 18. Even if no longer in foster youth because you may have been reunified with your parents or adopted, or you turned 18, you can mark the box and you'd be an independent student. Right below that is for students who are emancipated minors. They've gone through the court proceedings to be an emancipated minor. Right below that, the second last box is about someone other than a parent or step-parent has a legal guardianship of the student. So someone who is actually in a legal guardianship or was until they turned 18 is an independent student. Again, most likely Most students coming out of high school mark the none of the above. And then there's just one last question we have to ask. And it will say, on or after July 1st of this year, were you homeless or were you self-supporting and at risk of being homeless? And what they're trying to say here is, if a student is an unaccompanied homeless youth, they're an independent student. So it's three parts: unaccompanied, not with their parents; homeless, as homeless might be, all the things from couch surfing, living in a car, etc., and youth under the age of 24. If a student meets all three of those criteria, they're an independent student. But again, hopefully, really, truly, hopefully, most students in high school, the answer to that is no. And instead, you'll usually see a screen that looks like this that says, based on your answers, you're considered a dependent student and need parental information. Most of the time, you'll click where the little blue button is there that says, I will provide information about parents. But occasionally there's cases where you're truly unable to provide information about parents. So these are kind of the first of the what ifs. What if you've been, and this is the most common thing we hear, the student's been living with a relative other than the parents, and they have no idea where their parents are. Maybe out of the country, maybe one of them's deceased, the other one is unfindable, but the student's not in foster care. That relative has never taken on the legal guardianship paperwork. The student's not homeless. They've never been emancipated, so they kind of fall between the cracks. What do? In those type of rare cases, you can mark the unable to box, skip through the parent part of the form, complete the rest of the form that asks about student income and such, and submit the form. The schools get the results. We'll see on it that it's been marked as such. And what we'll do is that the student will have to follow up with the financial aid office to see if the school can override the federal rules. And again, in some of these rare cases, we can, where it's a case of the student has no ability to get information from their parents. Otherwise, for most students, we're going to assume that they can. And then it becomes a question of whose information to put on the FAFSA. So I'll kind of go through these boxes here. They've kind of laid it out a little differently this year than they did in prior years. So I don't want to go too fast or too slow here, but it's pretty straightforward in some sense. If the first top answer is correct, my parents live together, whether married or unmarried. So unmarried biological parents still living together. Even if they were never married, they're divorced, but nobody moved out. We're going to use information for both parents. Right below that, if it's the case of parents who are divorced or separated, and they mean the student, lives with one parent more than the other, generally over the last year, then we use that parent's information. Now, if the answer to that is a tie, like it says below, my parents are divorced or separated, and I live with both equally, right? If I clicked on that arrow on the right side, which I can't do because this isn't a live form, it would ask me which parent provided more financial support in the last year. And that's the parent who will provide information on the FAFSA. The last one about legally adopted, we'll just be providing information for whoever legally adopted the student if that's the case. So generally this applies to 99.9% of combinations of parents we can think of. You'll have one or two parents who need to provide information on the FAFSA. And at that point, going through the income part of the forms, the asset parts of the form, it'll all be about that parent or potentially two parents' information. You know, it says here, I'll answer the Q&A scene. We're kind of into the money part almost. And hold on a second here. So the question was, it was recommended to fill out the question that asks for our parents' assets. It's optional. Okay, what that's talking about is the FAFSA uses some smart logic behind it. And sometimes you get a question like, are your parents' assets over a certain value? And the reason is they're saying if it's below that value, it won't make a difference in the formula. Or sometimes they're just going to say yes or no, do you want to report it? It's optional. They're again saying it may not be needed for FAFSA calculation, but the state grant amazingly does have its own requirement to need asset information. Oftentimes it's a good idea to put that information onto the FAFSA. So I'll say I answered that one live. Going on to some other questions about income. So here's how to think of it as far as what year of tax returns to use. So it's either going forward or backward. So if we think of it in terms of we're applying for aid for fall of 2022, we're filling out the form in fall of 2021, a year earlier. And then in a sense, we're using the tax year before that, 2020. So that is the most complete year for most parents. There may be parents out there that you still got another week or so if you've got that extension, till October 15th, but that's the tax year to use on the FAFSA. So that's the first couple questions they'll ask. Have you completed a tax return? Will you complete one? Or are you not required to? They'll ask you what kind of tax return you did, just because occasionally we have foreign tax returns or things like that. And one of the things you'll see on that bottom part of the screen is it says recommended in little blue print under that little symbol, the IRS data retrieval tool. The IRS data retrieval tool, in a sense, is a way to import information directly from the IRS into the FAFSA. So by doing that, and that blue button at the bottom right is what it's about, the parent could, if they had filed a 2020 tax return, click on the button, do some data entry to confirm that they are who they are, and then the IRS will allow a certain amount of data to come into the FAFSA and answer most of the questions about income. Saves a lot of time. Let me see where I am. Oh, before I go to profile, I just want to go back real quick because I don't put a slide about assets directly because it can be a little confusing. So I'm going to try to be as general as I can. If you are answering the questions about assets, there are three categories. The first is cash, savings, and checking as of the day you're doing the FAFSA. So add up your cash, savings, and checking as of that day. The second item is investments. It's actually easier to tell you what not to include. Don't include the value of your house. Don't include value of retirement plans. Everything else kind of is an asset. So a second home value, the net worth, commercial property, a third home. Timeshares generally don't have to be included. I've checked that out a couple years ago, but things like 529 plans, if you have a 529 plan, generally goes into the parent's part of the assets. Even if the student who's applying to college has a 529 plan in their name from the parents, we'll include it in the parent's part of the assets. And the reason for that is actually beneficial for the student applying for aid in the sense that it doesn't get looked at as harshly in the formula compared to an asset of a student. Because again, the parents are supporting the family. They look much less, a smaller percentage of the assets when trying to calculate that expected family contribution. But let's talk a little bit about the CSS profile. So beyond the FAFSA, this is a form used by some colleges to award college-funded grants and scholarships. It will require more information than a FAFSA. I helped one parent just so I could see the form. And it took a little bit of time to do, no doubt. It's done online through the College Board. It is one of the few things in financial aid that costs a little bit of money. The good thing is, though, like it says right there, there's a fee waiver built in for lower income families, and they've raised that maximum income quite high. I think it's $100,000 for a two-parent household, so that most students will not skip this form because of cost. Here in California, these are the schools that I know that will be using it for the coming year and have used it generally in past years. Caltech, the Claremont colleges, so Scripps, Pomona, Pitzer, Claremont, Harvey Mudd. I'm sure I'm missing somebody. All of them. Occidental, Santa Clara University, Stanford, Thomas Aquinas College, UC San Francisco, not San Francisco State, but UC San Francisco, which is mostly a medical health school, so they don't have a lot of undergraduate programs. And of course, USC. Outside the state of California, your Ivy Leagues and your highly selective schools. University of Chicago, Washington University in St. Louis, and a variety of others. Very few public schools across the U.S. use the profile form because a college can just use the results of the FAFSA to award not just federal and state aid, which you have to use that form for, but they'll also award need-based aid from the school itself. So we've kind of covered federal and state aid. We've covered school aid. Now there's scholarships. You know, money available from just a variety of resources or sources out there. Will require separate applications, may require additional information, you know, letters of recommendation, transcripts, essays, and such. Check with your high school counselors is the best thing I can always say about scholarship opportunities they may know of or hear of, or if you've heard of one or gotten solicited for something that doesn't sound too legitimate. Because one of the things is we want to make certain you use free online resources to look for scholarships, and beware of those that charge money. I can't guarantee that someone out there charging for money isn't going to be a better deal, but I have yet to find one really compared to what's available out there for free. And again, just some of, this is not an exhaustive list, but these are some of the biggest free scholarship searches out there and available. Fastweb.com has been around forever. The College Board calls theirs Big Future. So it's information about colleges and all kinds of stuff, and a scholarship search. Scholarships.com. College Answer, which is part of Sallie Mae. They used to handle student loans. Now they don't do so much because it's all with the federal government. And then scholarshipamerica.org. But there are other ones, and the big thing is they're free searches. They're not offering scholarships themselves. They have databases of scholarships that are available from local sources, regional sources, nationwide sources. So a little bit about process. You know, the idea is to submit that FAFSA, or for our dreamers, the DREAM Act form, and potentially that CSS Profile form, depending upon the schools you're looking at, and get them done sooner than later. Schools will get the results of it. The federal government will process the FAFSAs. The California Student Aid Commission will process the DREAM Act form, and also process FAFSAs for Cal Grant consideration. And the colleges get all that information. Assuming you've applied to us, we'll put it through our computer and what we do call the weird name packaging of financial aid. It's not that we send a box out or anything. We send you usually emails, but we'll send a financial aid offer that summarizes what you've qualified for. You know, free money first, loans and work study options, if those are options that you want to consider. But hopefully you get those award offers usually in early spring, April, hopefully at the latest, because we know there's that May 1st decision date for most four-year schools that you want to decide where you're going so that you can lock in your enrollment, your admissions, you know, your acceptance and your financial aid offer. Once you've selected a school, you will potentially have to accept or decline the self-help aid. Self-help aid is the work study and the student loans, because those are options. And in a sense, you're helping yourself. You're working for it. Student loans, you're going to repay them when you're done with school. So I talked about the what ifs regarding dependency, but there's some other what ifs out there, especially during this pandemic time. And this is where you definitely want to contact the financial aid office if something like one of these things has occurred. You know, loss of income or a job by a parent or student. Again, we're using 2020 tax return information. Now, 2020 on its own might not have been a good year for you, but what if 2021 is even worse? Obviously, the FAFSA doesn't have a way for you to tell them so. This is something you work through the school, and you can't just decide to pick your 2021 tax year info to put in. You have to use what the FAFSA says. But things like unusual medical or dental expenses not covered by insurance, or a reduction in child support, or other non-taxable income that you put on the FAFSA because of what they asked for, but might not be, you're not receiving it anymore. These type of things, schools will handle differently, but we normally have a process that's relatively similar from school to school. Well, the type of documentation we need, maybe documentation of unemployment or documentation of a layoff or termination that helps us understand beyond 2020 what's occurring, so we can get a better idea of the current year or future 6 months or whatever of what's real and closer to the reality of the financial wherewithal of the parents. But before making a decision, hopefully, a student will consider all the factors at hand. You know, the academic programs being offered by the school, campus feel, assuming you're going back to an actual campus, and hopefully you will. I mean, we have to at some point, everybody. Big school, small school, public school, private school, close to home, to be close to parents, far out of state, to experience the East Coast or whatever you want to say. You know, something different. Opportunities for campus involvement can be important. You know, so if you've been involved with campus organizations, clubs, intramurals, athletics, are those available at the colleges you're looking at? And for those specifically looking at, excuse me, like career colleges, the type of employment placement assistance that might be offered by the school. Because obviously, if you're doing a 1 or 2 year program, nursing programs are like this, automotive tech, a lot of medical related fields where you do 1 or 2 years intense studies and get right out into the work field. You want to make certain the school is helping you with that. As we close out and I get to the Q&A here, if you have questions beyond today, give the call. Give the financial aid office a call. Ask your questions about process, timelines, something you think you might be missing because you did the FAFSA, never heard back. Let's find out what's going on. On the internet, for federal aid, studentaid.gov. For state aid and to know more about Cal Grants, calgrants.org. My website is not an all-exhaustive website, but it has everything about the aid that I offer at my school, timelines, deadlines, forms. LA Cash for College is a great resource in the sense that it talks about all the different information around Los Angeles as far as free FAFSA workshops or other assistance and scholarships that might be available in the area. The LA Chamber of Commerce helps work on that. For information about federal aid or questions about the FAFSA, not 24/7. When the sun goes down, they're kind of done for the day. Federal Student Aid Information Center at 1-800-4FED-AID or 800-433-3243 is available. And lastly, see your counselor. Counselor Sheridan will find me if she doesn't have the answer, and we'll do a little email exchange on tougher topics. Hopefully I'll get through the tougher ones on the Q&A here in just a second. Well, like I said, I'll throw these slides up here real quick. This is a shortcut to get to the PDF of the English version. And I'm just going to go forward real quick. The Spanish version put together by my staff has the /SP at the end. Let me cover some of the Q&A here. So the question would be about a widowed parent. Which would you click? There should be one that will allow for just one parent data entry in that case, assuming the widowed parent is not remarried. 401ks, that's a retirement plan, does not have to get included in the assets at all. So any type of regular retirement plan, 401ks, IRA, KIOs, pension plans, not included in the asset. Okay, let's see, schools. Yeah, so what in a sense, so when we were talking about the school listings, if you delete off the schools and add new ones, they still have received your results of the FAFSA. They can still process the student for financial aid. The website says something about those replaced schools not being able to access the info moving forward. No, they still can, as long as they had been listed and you submitted. Now, conceivably, if you take a school off, add some new schools, and by the time you're settling down to your last couple of schools, your last school of choice, and you've been accepted, maybe make sure you've added them back in case they were not on the final list. Just because if you've made any other adjustments along the way, maybe you updated your phone number or something, they may not have that information from an update. Question, is there an income level that is too high to receive any financial aid? Not specifically for federal aid. It's a formula to calculate that expected family contribution. Now, the state Cal Grants do have specific cutoffs for income and assets for the size of family for determining Cal Grant eligibility. I don't have the chart for that. If you ever want to try to find it, you could put in like, and I don't know if it's available quite yet, but if you Google income and asset ceilings for Cal grants, they call them ceilings. So income and asset ceilings for Cal grants, you may be able to find the chart for Cal grants A and B and C that tells you for this size of family, the maximum allowable income and assets. Question about including stocks as assets. Again, if they're not in a retirement account, yes. Cars, no, unless that's Jay Leno on the, that's an investment. But for most of us, our cars would not be considered investments. 529 plans under the name of other siblings will go under the parents' part of the assets. Unless those, now this is the one caveat, is if the 529 plan is owned by someone other than the parents. So in that case, like say it's a grandparent, the value of the 529 plan does not go on to FAFSA at all. So thank you, Grandma. But the distributions later that you'll take out of the 529 plan to pay for college may show up on the FAFSA later, because there will be some lines sometimes that say other income received by the student during whatever that tax year was. So it may show up as a distribution, but the value of those plans owned by grandma for a student or another sibling, the value of the plan does not show on the FAFSA. Question, what if the parents have not filed taxes in the last 2 to 3 years? That is possible, certainly. There may be some question about taking care of that. It's different if it's a case they do not have to file because they're below the minimum cutoff for needing to file. But in a sense, if you are applying for financial aid, you probably would need to get current on that, because that could be an issue that the school would not be able to verify the income information. And if it looks like, I don't have to be a tax expert, they say at the financial aid office, according to the federal government, but I do have to know that, is your filing status correct? And if you were required to file according to income and such, if you did file or not. So you might have to take care of that. What if your income is less in 2021? Is it possible to submit with 2021 income? No. So you can't do that on your own, but you can ask the financial aid office about that what if slide I was talking about and say, we have a big change in income. There's usually like a standard form that says what happened and what kind of documentation that made the difference from 2020 to 2021, and see if we can make an adjustment to the overall eligibility for the student. Another question here, does the scholarship affect the amount of financial aid to be received? Generally not, it does not affect federal and state aid. It probably is not reported as income. There's very rare cases that you have to report those things, and that's one area I'm not a tax expert on. But generally, no. It may affect other aid that the school gives, and this is something some states are trying to help minimize, because most of the time with private universities, if they know you're getting a very large outside scholarship from some organization, that may affect how much money of school scholarship money they may offer you. Let's see here. So if I'm applying to GCC after my senior year, that's the school I would add to the FAFSA. Generally, any school, yes, that you would want to be considering for the fall of 2022, that's the schools you want to list on the FAFSA. Now, if you are going to summer school, summer 2022 for our high school seniors here, you'll want to make sure you do both, actually do both FAFSAs. The one that's out before October 1st, that's still out, the 2021-2022, and the 2022-23 one that came out just a few days ago. The reason is summer, we can use a FAFSA for the year that's ending or the year that's starting, and we use the one that gives more money to the student. So sometimes if there was differences in income, the formula is not a whole lot different, but differences in income, maybe that older FAFSA gets you slightly more money. It only affects summer though. So if you're going to school in the fall and not going to summer college, don't worry about it. Let's see here. Session seems to time out. I've tried different browsers and computers. Is there a better time of day? I don't really know. That is one of those issues sometimes with the FAFSA, especially come October 1st through about the 7th, the first 7 to 10 days can be a little tough. Now, it probably won't make a big difference in aid eligibility if you wait a few more days, But yeah, the timing out, it's hard to say what it is as far as browsers and other things. I would always say clear cookies and history and stuff like that from your browser to help that out a little bit. Let's see here. If parents can earn an income that is considered higher than middle class, is a student still eligible for FAFSA? Anyone's eligible to apply through the FAFSA. What it is the output of it. What is that expected family contribution? And it does have to fall relatively low. And again, not being able to tell you a set income level on this. But again, I worked with a parent one time who had a near 7-figure income. They were not going to get Pell Grant. They weren't going to get Cal Grant. But potentially, scholarships need to know that you've done the FAFSA at least. And sometimes even at more expensive schools where you may not get need-based aid at a low-cost school, at a higher cost school, that EFC subtracted from the cost of attendance could still come up with a positive number for some kind of need-based aid from the school itself. Let's see here. Can colleges, let's see here. Hold on. We're getting close here. How long does it take to complete the FAFSA on average? I'm going to say much less than an hour if you've got all your information with you. If you do the data retrieval tool, could be even less. And let's see. And is it true that if we have greater financial benefit if we complete early? Some schools do have early application priority deadlines, they'll call it. And that's usually for some limited school money that's first come, first serve. Pell Grants, student loans, Cal Grants, other than the March 2nd deadline, don't have a first come, first serve thing to them. How about debts? So that question about home loans and stuff like that doesn't factor into the FAFSA. Credit card debt and all that doesn't get factored into the FAFSA. Now, it's something you could ask about in the financial aid office to see if there's anything they can do. But usually with debts, there's not a lot that we can really do to offset things in the FAFSA formula. Let's see if you have multiple students, twins, triplets, etc., going to college at the same time. Does the FAFSA take that into account? Currently it does, and it will for the next couple years. So what might have been an expected family contribution of, say, $10,000 for one student in college might almost be half of that, $5,000, if there's two going to college. Because, of course, it's not that the parents have to double up on the amount of money. It's what they would have had to contribute has to be divided over two kids. But the formula is kind of doing some changes. So in a few years, that might kind of wash out a little bit. The part about if twins are applying for aid together, in a sense, they're actually going to do separate FAFSAs. So the FAFSA is for the student themselves. But if you got both kids in the room, have one do their FAFSA, and usually once you're done with that one, something will come up on screen and say, would you like to start another child's FAFSA? They do that because it will save a little bit of time in the parent information that needs to be provided. You'll transfer it over to the next FAFSA for free. Child support on the FAFSA? Yes, it's reported on the FAFSA as other income under the parent's part of the form. Let's see, how about athletic scholarships? Would that affect the amount of financial aid? Generally, it could affect other aid other than the Pell Grant. The Pell Grant is generally considered kind of like an entitlement, so it's not something that a school would ever take away from. But a student with potentially a full ride athletic scholarship might not have any need for student loans, work study, even Cal Grants to a point, but Pell Grant they would get regardless. Let's see here. Last couple questions we got. In the past years, how fast did the financial aid pool run out? We have yet to run out of Pell Grant money in any given year or student loans. Again, it's up to the school as far as if there's school money that's first come, first served. That's going to be very school specific. And let's see here. Are there rules about separated parents and who has to apply written anywhere? It's in the law that runs the FAFSA. So those questions that come up in the FAFSA are what guides it. So divorce or separation in short. Again, if the student lives with one parent more than the other, that's the parent we use on the FAFSA. If it's equal time, 50-50, then we use information from the parent who provided more financial support. Now, I will tell you in a couple years, that is a rule that's also going to change a little bit. They're cutting out the first part and going with just the second part. In a couple years, the FAFSA will just say who provided more support. But for now, it's the time thing. So if they happen to just by chance live with the parent providing less financial support, but they live with them more, in a sense that's advantageous right now. So take advantage of that while you can. Let's see here on the FAFSA form, question 92. What does untaxed income refer to? So untaxed income would basically be income that's not on the tax return that falls under certain types of categories. Not military benefits, because most of that doesn't show up. Most of the time, it might be, I'm trying to think of other categories of things that it falls under. Child support was probably the one main one that would be counted as other untaxed income. Let's see here. What point or age can college students be considered independent? 24. Unless they go to graduate school, then as soon as you're a graduate student, you're independent. Otherwise, again, getting married, not to push that on anybody, but if you get married, you're an independent student. Same thing like have independence that you provide more than half the support for. And again, you shouldn't be doing that too soon. Anyways, either do that at an appropriate time. But yeah, 24 years old. Ms. Sheridan, I think we've covered all the questions that are out there and available.
I think so.
I'm going to close the box.
Thank you very much. Yeah, fabulous. And remember, parents and students, see your counselor if you have additional questions, and we will find an answer or reach out to Mr. Schroeder if we can't come up with the answer for you and find the right answer for you. And I know that the website has been difficult this week. We've heard that from other people as well, but it will lighten up, and I don't think you will have a problem with that going forward.
Yeah, give it a few days. Give it a few days here.
All right. Thank you very much, Dennis. And Bill, thank you so much for hosting this for us. And our interpreters, thank you very much for being here and helping us. This is very important information to get out there. Thanks.
All right. Thank you, everyone.
All right. Night now.